Welcome to the Pulse of Power with me, Alex Dugard. I am very privileged to be joined today by Sir Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats, former MP for Twickenham and former business secretary. Sir Vince, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yes.
So today is quite a monumentous day this year. We've been talking about the budget for several weeks and months now, and today we've finally seen it. And the big word that people have been using to describe it is a smorgasbord of a budget. And I was wondering, how would you sum it up in a word or phrase?
Well, complicated, I think, is the simpler way of describing it. Lots of small tax-raising measures. And I think that's part of the problem. There's a lack of overall clarity, a lack of a vision about, what they're trying to do. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to raise taxes given the state of the British economy, but in my view, it should have been done in a more straightforward way. They should have raised the basic rate of income tax. I know that was a manifesto commitment, very foolish, but, sometimes you have to recognise reality when you're in government. And, if you're going to have a go at property, which is fine, property should be taxed properly. It should be part of a kind of long-term reform program involving, revaluation for council tax or proportionality in the tax rate instead of just slapping some small levy which raises a modest amount of money. So my main concern is the lack of clarity, the lack of simplicity, the lack of a sense of direction.
Yeah, indeed. And, we spoke about how there's a smorgasbord. You mentioned property taxes. What would you say was the most significant measure from today's budget?
Well, I think probably the most significant measure in the eyes of the public, and it does involve quite a lot of money, which is getting rid of the two-child cap on benefits, which I support, actually. A lot of people who have been very critical of it, but of course it applies to working families. With one parent in work, they're the people who make most use of universal credit. Of course, people out of work too, but a lot of in-work people. It is a big driver of child poverty, people often stunted very early in life. I think the government was quite right it was one of its political priorities, but it was a good thing to do. But I think the big theme that they were trying to get across was the need to have fiscal prudence in order to maintain the confidence of the money lenders, the markets, bond dealers, however you want to describe them. And that was the basic objective. If they lost the confidence of the markets so they couldn't borrow, then they would be back in a very deep financial crisis. So that was the kind of overriding objective. But within that, I would say probably the cap on benefits removal, and the big tax raising measure is the freezing of the allowance on the income tax, which in my view is very retrograde. In the coalition government, the Lib Dems worked very hard to get the tax threshold up because that's a particular relevance and benefit to low earners. As it is, by not attacking the basic rate of tax and just freezing allowances, they've hit low-paid workers rather than high-paid workers, which is the exact opposite of the government's rhetoric and supposed beliefs.
Yeah, and many people would describe that as a stealth tax, and the government hopes it will raise £10 billion. And it's been tried since 2022, first by the Conservatives, now extended by Rachel Reeves. Is this the government's favourite new tax rise? Is it easy to raise taxes in this way?
Well, I think they think that probably people are just not smart enough to realise what's happening, whereas increasing the basic rate is very visible and obvious. But actually, I think it's a false economy. I think most people have puzzled out that if you freeze the rate, you get sucked into taxation sooner or later. Quite a lot of middle earners, senior nurses or police officers or teachers are getting sucked into the 40% band, and quite a lot of low-paid workers and pensioners also are now paying income tax when they didn't before. And people realise that. I mean, they're not completely stupid.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for a long time, up until quite recently, we thought they were going to raise the basic rate of income tax as sort of a clean way to raise the revenue but that would break their manifesto commitment. Do you think that was a foolish commitment to make?
It was extremely foolish. In fact, the whole government has really been paralysed in terms of tax policy because of that commitment they made before the election. I mean, other parties have done this. The Conservatives made repeated pledges to keep net immigration at a certain level. They hopelessly failed to do it and became rather discredited, and that's partly what's opened the way to the Reform Party. My own party made a rather foolish promise about tuition fees, which we had to abandon faced with the reality of government, and that did us quite a lot of harm. So, the political spin doctors, or whoever it is, draws up manifestos and manages the media in the way to election. I mean, they've got a lot to account for.
Yeah, and interestingly, from about the 1970s to up to the 2010s, there were often 10 to 20 measures in a budget. But since George Osborne's time in Downing Street, and ever since, the number of new measures in a budget have increased steadily to a point where we're getting almost 100 new measures in each budget. And do you think that those sort of very small incremental measures that basically tinker around the edges are quite catastrophic from an economic point of view?
Well, they're not catastrophic, but it's debilitating because we already have one of the most complex tax systems in the world. I think India is the only country that has more pages of tax law. So it's already complicated. It's making it more complicated. And that's particularly difficult, for example, for small businesses who haven't a great deal of time to be working their way around all these complex procedures. A lot of the new measures are often to stop tax avoidance from previous complex measures. So it tends to build on itself. Government introduces new things, creating a new tax or a new regulation, and then that creates avoidance, and then new regulations are brought in to stem the avoidance. So it becomes a kind of cumulative process. And as a result, the whole economy becomes much less effective and much less efficient.
Interesting. And I suppose the reason why those manifesto commitments were made, and indeed by parties before Rachel Reeves, is because many parties are terrified of the electorate saying, sort of having fright as when they see that, they're going to raise our taxes, we're not voting for them. And
yes, well, that is the rationale, and and I need to be rather careful here not to sound sort of condescending, patronising, whatever. But a lot of surveys show that the public wants lower taxes, more spending, and lower government debt, which of course is 2 + 2 = 5. It doesn't add up. And politicians have got to be brave enough to say, sorry, we can't deliver what the public want. It cannot be done. We're going to have a period of difficulty. Some tough choices will have to be made. And to say that before the election rather than after.
yeah, so from that point of view, do you think our tax system is fundamentally dishonest?
Yes, there is a fundamental dishonesty at the heart of it, because there is an aspiration to have, Scandinavian quality public services, but we don't have Scandinavian levels of tax to finance it, which if you look at the 5 Scandinavian countries, they have value-added tax at 25%, for example. So we're not willing to pay for the services that people expect. And instead of the politicians turning around to the public and saying, look, we've got to get real here, there's a constant tendency to, get votes by promising to deliver more than is deliverable. And the fact that the economy has been growing very, very slowly for the last almost 20 years now, since the financial crisis, not just in Britain, but everywhere, has just made all of that much more difficult.
Yeah, and we spoke about one of the key measures earlier being what some call a mansion tax, the changes to the top band of council tax. Could this cause a housing market crash?
No. It's as I understand it, is a very limited measure, and I think I would claim to be the first person to advocate it. Actually, to have higher rates of council tax on properties. I'm not sure what today's limit is. It 1.5, 2 million?
Yeah, so it's an annual payment of 2,500 if for properties over 2 million, and a payment of 7,500 for properties over 5 million.
Yes, well, actually, if you're doing this properly, it should be graduated. It should be a proportion of the value of the property, not two artificially created slabs. That's very much a second best option. But no, the principle of having council tax related to the value of the property is a good one in principle, but you've got to go through the whole process of revaluation and annual corrections, which take place through. I mean, it can be done. Other countries do it. I mean, Denmark has a tax based on property values. The United States has a residential property taxation of that kind. But it involves setting up a system, not just some one arbitrary swipe at a particular group of people.
Yeah, indeed. And because they haven't sort of revalued council tax in general and looked at all the bands, just the top band, do you think that this is much more a case of political theatre, sort of pondering to their backbenchers rather than sort of a proper economic
well,
argument?
it is the right thing to do to have high value property paying more property tax than low value property. I mean, we were in an utterly absurd situation where vast mansions, bought by extremely rich people, professional champion Premier League footballers, quite apart from entrepreneurs, were actually paying less tax than people in small houses in cities. I mean, it was just made absolutely no sense. So this is a partial correction, and it was right to move in that direction. I would just like it to be the first step in a much more comprehensive system of reforming the taxation of property.
And one thing I'd say that I fear as a result of this, I'd say particularly those who perhaps are on the 2 million threshold, who bought their house maybe 50 years ago for below $1 million, for hundreds of thousands of pounds, and are asset rich but cash poor. And as a result, this could be quite tough, particularly if they've stopped working and they don't really have a cash flow.
Yes, I don't buy that argument, actually.
Okay.
If people are cash poor but asset rich, there's a very simple way of unlocking income from the capital, which is through equity release schemes. And the equity release schemes need to be properly regulated. But there is a financial mechanism available for solving that problem.
Yeah.
And if people are thinking a bit more deeply, I mean, I'm in this position. I'm a single person occupying a family house. I ought to be downsizing in the interests of society as a whole. And hopefully, this tax might prompt more and more old fogies like me to think of moving into something smaller and freeing up a family house. So actually, that would be a socially progressive step.
Yeah, indeed. But if the price of those houses actually falls, and we have a situation where there's negative equity, plus there's the obstacle of stamp duty when you paying stamp duty when you downsize, do you think that actually could gum up the housing market even more?
Well, it's very difficult to get into negative equity if you're a pensioner, which is the group of people we're talking about. I mean, if you're a young person, ambitious, got a very big salary, and so you've taken out maximum mortgage to get a very big, luxurious house, well, it's conceivable you could be caught in a negative equity trap. But it's a hypothetical case you're talking about. It's not the real world problem. So I don't see this as having the damaging consequences you describe at all. But your point about stamp duty is very valid. Stamp duty is a very bad tax. It gums up the housing market. It is a discouragement to downsizing, exactly as you say. But we should tackle that separately by replacing the stamp duty by some other form of taxation. It would be a land value tax or a much more substantial tax based on the value of property.
Yeah, and we spoke about pensioners there. One of the big measures today was reforming tax-free allowances on ISAs and savings and sort of the tax-free lump sum. Do you think that's a stealth raid?
Well, it can be characterised as that. I mean, it is certainly true that higher rate taxpayers do benefit benefit disproportionately from the tax reliefs on pension contributions. So it's tempting for any government to cut back on that. I think in the big picture, you don't want to do things that reduce the rate of national savings. What I think we should be focusing on, and I think the government does get some credit for having done this, is looking about how pension funds can contribute more to the growth of the economy. Because at the moment, they churn very rapidly. They're very short term. A lot of their investment takes place overseas. So if the government can reform the pension system and pension companies and pension funds in such a way that they're channeled into supporting risk-taking in the British economy, and if they do this systematically, then I would encourage that.
Yeah, but I suppose saving can often be the right thing, putting money aside for a rainy day. And I'd say the last thing we'd want to do is discourage that. Do you think that this could?
Well, I think the measures we're talking about apply to people with really quite large pension pots. The people who ought to be saving are the people on low incomes, because they are the people who will be faced, hopefully in not too many years, with the phasing out of the triple lock, which has to happen. But it does currently provide a kind of floor underneath the state pension. And if that is, if we're going to move ahead to a world where there isn't quite such lavish and expensive provision, people have got to make better provision for their own savings. And we're talking here about low earners. We're not talking about people with vast pension funds.
Yeah, and the triple lock is obviously becoming even increasingly hard to sustain. Yet for now, the Tories and Labour are both committed to it. We're yet to hear from Reform what they do, but for now that is quite a big constraint on a welfare bill that's rising. And we talked about earlier the 2-child cap increasing costs about $3.5 billion to increase. Now you say you support that. Do you think it's the best way though to reduce child poverty?
Well, it's the best known measurement to reduce child poverty. So I actually think that was a good step. I was in the government that introduced the restriction in the first place. I'm not proud of that. I think it was a bad move. Britain is actually an ageing society, so we shouldn't be introducing tax measures that discourage people from having children and discouraging mothers from staying and looking after their children at home, which many of them choose to do. So getting rid of the cap was, in my view, a necessary and progressive thing to do.
Yeah, and looking at wider benefits, the benefits bill is going to increase by about 15 billion, with overall benefits rising in line with inflation. And we saw earlier this year the government had to abandon their plans for savings on personal independence payments owing to a backbench rebellion. Do you think that they need to come back and try again to reduce the welfare bill?
Well, I would start with pensioners. I am one. But I think we're very generously treated relative to other sectors of the population, and have been protected from all the difficulties following the financial crisis. So I think if you're trying to cut the welfare bill overall, the first step will be to phase out the triple lock, have a double lock or in some other way, and also raising the pension age, which also likely to be unpopular, but has to happen. And then you look at the working age benefits, which people tend to focus on. And undoubtedly there are anomalies there. There are a lot of people who are temporarily sick but are becoming permanently disabled, which is not sensible. I think the government understands the problem, and they've set up under Stephen Timms some committee to look at how you look at it. I mean, the obvious problem area are people getting personal independence payments. Some of them are genuinely seriously disabled, they need help. but the eligibility criteria are probably too generous in some cases. But dealing with that with kind of broad measures is very difficult. We talk about individuals and individual needs, which are very difficult for governments to assess on high. You need people to look at individual cases.
Yeah, and one of the big things that have happened since the pandemic is the reduction in face-to-face assessments. And the Tories say that they're going to reduce welfare spending by 23 billion, and one of the big headline measures in that is ramping up face-to-face assessments and tightening eligibility criteria, as you just said. Do you think that face-to-face assessments would actually result in a significant reduction in the bill?
It would help, but of course you have to pay for the assessments.
Yeah,
and I was MP for long enough, and I met enough disabled people to realise that the face-to-face assessment often produced ridiculous and quite cruel outcomes. For example, you have people who are not necessarily fully qualified doctors. They're being asked to make instant judgments on what are often very complicated physical or mental disabilities. The tests are often very simple. You're asking somebody with a mental illness to walk in a straight line to prove whether they're disabled. I mean, it can be ridiculous. So face-to-face assessments are clearly better than assessment by computer or some mechanised system, but they're going to produce anomalies and cruelties. And the idea that you can squeeze vast amounts of money out of the system in that way is an illusion, and politicians shouldn't be promising it.
Yeah. And I want to turn to some of the wider taxes. We mentioned earlier the word smorgasbord being used to talk about the many small new taxes being introduced. And one of the ones that was introduced, which Ed Davey has been calling for a bit now, is a tax on online gambling, which is also shared in support by Gordon Brown. Do you think that's a sensible measure?
Well, at first sight it is, yeah. It's a social negative, it's a sin tax, basically, like alcohol and tobacco. But, of course, the people who pay the price are gambling addicts, many of whom have a psychological problem and need help. Of course, in the short run, all you're doing is making their lives more difficult. Of course, it's not going to be played by the gambling companies. They'll simply pass on to the punters. But, in principle, it could raise some revenue, and it could discourage behaviour that we want discouraged.
Yeah. And one of the big things that's being talked about in political debate is the topic of net zero. And an interesting measure today was a pay-per-mile tax on electric vehicles. And I wonder that in a time when we're trying to encourage the transition away from petrol and diesel vehicles towards electric vehicles, is this a bit counterproductive?
Well, the whole transport tax system has got to be converted into payment per mile. I mean, that is a logical way of taxing pollution and congestion and the other negative consequences of transport. The question is how you get there. If you just put a levy on electric vehicles while freezing the fuel duty, which is what they've done, you are going to encourage people to switch back to petrol and diesel or discourage people from going into electric vehicles. So you've got to, I think the end goal of having road user pricing is a sensible one, but just doing it with arbitrary short-term, elastoplast sticking type mechanisms is not going to help that process. But the issue about how we move to electric vehicles is, of course, a far bigger one. As it happens, I'm chairman of a company that's been trying to introduce hydrogen into the road haulage system, and another consortium of companies that's trying to bring batteries into heavy goods vehicles. And the tax regime needs to be very, very carefully adjusted to make sure that you don't disrupt this process.
Yeah, and alongside that, Rachel Reeves announced that she's going to continue to extend the fuel duty freeze. Is that another unsustainable
Well,
area?
it's another bit of weak politics. I
Yeah.
mean, to be fair, the government I was in did that. The successor governments did it. It's one of these populist things, a bit like the triple lock that politicians are terrified and tampering with. But actually, if we were being serious about revenue and serious about discouraging pollution, we wouldn't be shying away from it. Now, the reason they haven't done it this year is because it would have a significant effect on inflation in the short run.
Yeah. And alongside new road taxes, we have a sugar tax, which was introduced by the coalition government, but now covers more area, particularly dairy products. Some people have branded it a milkshake tax. But aside from the slogans, looking at the principle of a sugar tax, do you think that this is a good measure to widen it?
Well, the principle of using taxes as a way of changing behaviour is a sensible one. I mean, nobody now quarrels with the idea of high levels of taxation on tobacco, cigarettes. You have to find ways of persuading people to give up, and taxation has proved a very good way of doing it. And to some extent, the same is true of alcohol. So if there is sound science pointing to the damaging effects of sugar in the diet, and there seems to be, then it seems perfectly sensible to use the taxation system to push people in the right direction, providing it's moderate and providing it doesn't have a significant effect on the cost of living and therefore on inflation and interest rates.
Yeah, and one of the big arguments that the Conservatives have been making is that it's business that creates growth and not government. And you were business secretary, and many on the right have been saying that the government have been waging sort of a war on business, with last year's rise in employers' national insurance contributions, and this year we have a new tax on the hospitality sector. Some brand it as a tourism tax, but basically an extra charge on tourist venues. Do you think that this is a bad tax and will severely hit the
Well, I
hospitality
think you're running
sector?
together a whole lot of different things there. The starting proposition is that businesses create growth. Well, they do, but of course government can help. And actually, one of the positive things that the government has done is to enable the government borrowing to finance investment, which is something we didn't do in the coalition, and even Gordon Brown wasn't able to do it, which is why we had the private finance initiative. So government investment alongside private investment is positive. But whether the government is encouraging business or not, certainly when I was in government, we did our best to stimulate business. One of the things George Osborne was very keen on was cutting corporation tax. You can argue that that was a rather blunt instrument, but it was actually a Conservative government that then reversed it, right? So if you're thinking about the impact of tax on business, I would think that corporation tax is probably the one you should be looking at.
Yeah, and interestingly, when we think about all these taxes, none of them have come as a surprise, because there was a series of leaks and briefings, and actually culminating in today with the OBR publishing its forecast early before the budget statement had actually started. And it begs the question, is the Treasury and the OBR still fit for purpose?
Well, the Treasury does a lot of things wrong. In my experience, I was in government for 5 years. They're often extremely clever people, but they can get big decisions wrong. I think, in my view, they had this obsession with curbing government investment when I was there, which has made absolutely no sense and has done us quite a lot of harm. The problem is how you reconfigure government to deal with that problem. Going back when I was a young man, we had not Gordon Brown but George Brown, who brought in a very powerful planning ministry to counter the weight of the Treasury. You could move to something a bit like that, a bit like the German model, where there is a finance ministry that does the national accounts, basically, and makes the budget numbers add up. And then you have an economic ministry that is supposed to be driving economic growth. You could get something similar here. And the department that I headed potentially has that kind of role, rather than having a large amount of power concentrated in the Treasury. So my inclination is to move in that direction. But your question started with the Office of Budget Responsibility. I think one of the key positive things which has come out of this recent round is the decision not to have a twice yearly assessment, because that just encourages short-term tinkering.
Yeah, and this budget, like last year, are both quite heavy tax-raising budgets. Which one do you think was better?
Well, I wouldn't think that's the right question. The problem was that because the first one wasn't brave enough or aggressive enough on taxation, we've had to have a second tax-raising budget. It would have been much better if Rachel Reeves had come to the country a year ago and said, look, we've got a horribly unbalanced budget. We've got serious problems with maintaining confidence in markets. You saw what happened with Liz Truss. So I'm afraid, my first budget is going to be a quite unpleasant tax-raising budget, and we're going to raise some of the basic taxes, value-added tax, income tax, whatever, and get the budget on the level, because they couldn't do that because they'd made these silly promises. And having then balked at doing what they needed to do, they've had to come back for a second dip. I mean, what would be terminal if they had to come back for another tax-raising budget? I think that would completely knock some people say it already has, but that would completely knock the stuffing out of the government and probably people's confidence in democratically elected governments generally.
Yeah, do you think this one does the job, though?
Well, it's probably, I think, is probably the answer.
Okay. Well, Sir Vince, thank you very much. That's the end of part one on the budget. In part two, we'll be looking at Sir Vince's incredible political career from his time moving from the Labour Party to the SDP and to the Liberal Democrats, through the coalition period, and then today's wider politics. So, I want to start with quite a wide question. Why did you go into politics?
Well, I didn't sort of go into politics, as you put it. I'd always been interested, and when I was in my 20s, I lived in Glasgow. I was politically active, but I went into politics in the sense that I was, first of all, elected to Glasgow City Council. I was one of the ruling group and got heavily involved in running the roads and traffic system in Glasgow in my 20s, right? But I also had a family, and I also had the need to earn a living. And certainly after the Glasgow experience, the next 25 years or so, I was doing career development, applying economics in the public, private sector, home, overseas, and with my lovely family. I did actually stand for Parliament 3 times before I got elected, three more times after Scotland. But except for the last, when Twickenham was becoming a marginal seat, I was quite a long way off from winning. So it wasn't a hobby, but it wasn't a profession. It was somewhere between the two. It was something I wanted to do, but my top priority was sort of earning a living and looking after my family.
Yeah, and you were initially part of the Labour Party before moving to the SDP and then to the Liberal Democrats. Did you learn anything from being part of 3 different parties?
Well, I always felt, even as a student, that there was a kind of fault line around what you call the centre-left. There were a lot of people in the then Liberals, quite a small party in the 1960s when I got involved, and people on the Social Democratic wing of the Labour Party. There was a lot of overlap, and I honestly found it very difficult to choose the one or the other. I got involved in the Labour Party in Glasgow because the Liberals didn't exist effectively. It was Labour or Conservatives or Scottish Nationalists. So I got involved in the Labour Party. I had quite a lot of common beliefs. Apart from my experience as a city councillor, I worked briefly for John Smith when he was in the Callaghan cabinet as his special advisor, and I had great respect for him. So I felt perfectly comfortable in the Labour Party until after 1979, when there was effectively a civil war, and you had what's sometimes called the hard left, certainly in the place where I lived. I'd moved to Twickenham, who were dominant. I found very little in common with them. There were a lot of trots, hardline Marxist-Leninists. I had nothing in common with those people at all. And when there was a split, and the Gang of Four, as they were called, led by Roy Jenkins, broke away from the Labour Party, I felt I had more in common with them.
Yeah. And the SDP actually were polling very high during Mrs. Thatcher's first term in government. Do you think there are any parallels to their polling and their rise to today's Reform Party?
I think there are a lot of parallels, and people are apt to forget them, and they should remember them, because when you're at a period when there is popular disillusionment with the two major parties for whatever reason, they're going to look for another outlet, and at that time, the Gang of Four had credibility. They were saying things people wanted to hear. Basically, that we needed a moderate alternative to the extremes of left and right. But it turned out to be a bubble. When circumstances changed, and particularly the Falklands War, it polarised public opinion in a different way. The SDP, like the Reform Party today, had a lot of support across the country, but it was widely distributed. It didn't result in parliamentary seats in the 1983 election. I was in York. I was the candidate in York, and there was one point at which we thought we were going to win, but the support drifted away, and actually the SDP Liberal Alliance scored less well in the general election than existed before. A lot of Labour defectors actually lost their seats. So there is this kind of bubble phenomenon, and there is the phenomenon that you can have quite a high public opinion rating for a period of time, but it doesn't necessarily translate into parliamentary seats.
Yeah, and do you think that Reform, in the same way that the SDP did, could start to sort of flatline and lose their appeal?
I think it will, but I think just focusing on Reform is missing the central point that party loyalties are fragmenting generally. I mean, it's not just Reform. The Green Party have come from nowhere to mid-teens in the public opinion poll. The Lib Dems have about the same. You've got the Tories much diminished, but they're still there. Then in Scotland and Wales, you've got nationalist parties. So we've got fragmentation, but our voting system is essentially built around two parties, or two and a half.
Yeah. So I want to talk a bit about the coalition now. You were a big part in the formation of the coalition, and Gordon Brown famously phoned you early on a Sunday morning trying to make the case for a Liberal Democrat and Labour partnership. Why do you think that the Liberal Democrats chose to go with David Cameron rather than Gordon Brown?
Well, emotionally, I've often said this, my instincts were to work with Gordon Brown. I had a lot of respect for him, and I think our parties were more aligned than they were with the Tories. But there was a simple problem. Well, there were two problems. One was a problem of arithmetic. To have a stable government, you needed the Tories and the Lib Dems to work together. You could have cobbled together a multi-party rainbow coalition, but it wouldn't have survived very long. The second reason was that we were in an economic crisis situation. The country was just recovering from the financial crash, was in very deep trouble. There was potentially a major problem with so-called bond vigilantes that eventually brought down Liz Truss, but there was a great deal of worry at the time that Britain had a vast budget deficit that was going to require painful measures, and it required a strong government to deal with that.
Yeah, and in hindsight, are you glad that you went with the
No, I'm
Conservative?
glad I think it was the right thing to do. It was a very painful thing to do, and ultimately the Lib Dems suffered grievously from having been in the coalition at the next election. But it was the right thing to do. I think with hindsight, we could have, in the Lib Dem side, managed our relations with the Tories more effectively and a bit more, been a little less sucked in. It was a little bit too cosy at the leadership level, and I think the public sensed that, and they didn't like it. They wanted us to retain our identity more. But anyway, whatever happened, we did lose badly in 2008, but the Lib Dems have bounced back again. I mean, it is a resilient party, and it was important, I think, that we did have the experience of government.
Yeah, and Nick Clegg is quite outspoken about how successful the coalition was from an economic point of view in particular. Do you recognise that?
Yes, I do. We went into government at a time of great instability and worry about the future. We lasted 5 years. If you contrast that with what's happened since, I think 6 prime ministers, 7 prime ministers since. So it was a period of stability. I had my job for 5 years. I was able to do a lot in terms of creating improvements to the way bank lending operated, supporting innovation, trade promotion, a whole lot of things, which still survive as a constructive legacy, I think. And the mere fact that we operated there for 5 years, a lot of the economic indicators were going the right direction. We had a big fall in unemployment, for example. The economy growth was beginning to recover. I mean, we did some very painful things, and some things I disagreed with, but from an overall point of view, it must be considered a success. And it's just unfortunate that Brexit and then COVID, destroyed a lot of what we had achieved.
Yeah, and you say the Lib Dems had a tough result in 2015. Do you therefore think that the Lib Dems didn't get enough credit for the success?
Yeah, I think we didn't get enough credit. I think the Tories were, to use an old expression, were too clever by half. They wanted to be in government on their own. They didn't think through, Osborne and Cameron didn't think through the consequences of that, which, of course, with the Brexit referendum, amongst other things, they would have been much better off if they had not targeted the Lib Dems in the election, but they did. And almost all of their gains in 2015 were at our expense. I mean, they basically had this simple message: if you may like your Lib Dem MPs, they may be good guys, but if you vote for the Lib Dems, you're going to get Ed Miliband or the SNP, and a lot of Middle England, as we call it, was bought that message.
Yeah, and a lot of people also point to tuition fees. Did you foresee that catastrophe when you voted to rise tuition fees?
Well, I saw the catastrophe. I was very much opposed to making the promise, actually. I could see it would cause a lot of problems, which it did. I don't actually buy the argument that a bad result in 2015 was because of tuition fees. We had already lost large numbers of voters before that problem arose. About half of the Lib Dem vote consisted of Labour-inclined people who didn't forgive us for working with the Conservatives. So even if the tuition fee event had not happened, we would have done very badly at the next election. It was going to happen. But the tuition fee issue itself, it was very foolish. I think that we made that promise. Privately, I said that at the time. Some of us did. But we were stuck with it in government. It was perfectly clear that we had no alternative. Well, we did have alternatives, but they were even more unpalatable. We could have drastically cut the number of students. We could have taken money, even more money, from further education, which took a hit anyway, but we effectively killed off the further education sector. We wouldn't have been able to do what we did in boosting apprenticeships, a whole lot of things. But we took the decision that universities have to be financially sustaining, and that was the only way to do it.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that the leadership was quite cosy, but you were business secretary, you were a good big part of that cabinet. What were Cameron and Osborne like to work with?
Well, actually, rather easier than the public image might suggest. I found Osborne easier to work with because he had a sort of private charm and humour which wasn't apparent to the outside world necessarily. Cameron was he's now been demonised and criticised because he made this terrible gamble and failed over the Brexit and because of his entanglements with Greensill. But when he was Prime Minister, he was actually quite good at being a Prime Minister. He was a very good chair of the cabinet. He was very good at resolving disputes within government. He was, I think, respected by people on both sides of the coalition, and was, at the time, was thought to be a, above average Prime Minister.
Yeah, and Cameron and Osborne are often, are blamed directly, and are always touted with the headline of austerity. And Rachel Reeves was has been very clear for a while, saying there'll be no return to austerity. It's been a big part of their message. But austerity was part of a, as you say, quite a successful period of government. So do you think that it's actually got a unfairly poor rep?
Yes, I think so. It's a slogan, right? I mean, it's never been terribly clear what it means. I mean, any government of any party was going to have to engage in what's called fiscal retrenchment, right? There was going to be quite a long period of cuts, either in government services or tax increases. And the Darling Plan, as it was called, the outgoing Labour government, involved a very painful period of fiscal correction because we were in a very bad position. The government had spent vast sums of money bailing the economy out after the banking collapse. It was the right thing to do, but it meant that there was a big legacy of government debt that then had to be dealt with. So any government was going to make painful decisions, which is now called austerity. The question, I think the relevant question is, did we have the right balance of tax rises and spending cuts? And we could have chosen a different mix. I think probably it would have been better if we had had a bit more taxation and a bit less spending cuts, but it wouldn't have made an enormous amount of difference. And one of the reasons that taxes played a lesser role for the coalition was because we put so much emphasis on lifting low earners out of taxation through raising thresholds, which is actually a Lib Dem policy. So you can't blame the Conservatives for that.
Yeah, and although the Lib Dems had a tough result in 2015, do you think that coalition is should still be viewed as a good idea for the Liberal Democrats, particularly being such a strong force in Parliament today since the last election?
Yes, I don't think Ed Davey, if he's still leader in 2 or 3 years' time, is why he shouldn't be. I suspect his first instincts will be to look to another form of cohabitation presumably with Labour, if the circumstances arise, rather than going into a formal coalition. But I mean, coalition happens all the time in local government. I mean, the Lib Dems are very powerful in local government, and often it's Lib Dems on their own. Sometimes we work with other parties, Labour and Conservatives and Greens. So, our natural approach is to, collaborate with other people in a wider national interest. And that's the way that liberal parties in Europe behave. So, had it not been for our experience of dealing with the Conservatives, I think we would approach the future expecting it to be one of the options. But having been done over by the Tories last time, I think the instinct will be to look for a less formal linkage in future parliaments with whoever party we're working with.
Yeah, and interestingly, the Lib Dems did incredibly well last year in the election with 72 MPs. But interestingly, their share of the vote was about 12%. But one of the Lib Dems' big things that they advocate for is reform of the voting system. Do you think that actually the Lib Dems have actually cracked first past the post, and it's actually could actually be more beneficial for them to continue to concentrate their vote into certain areas like they are at the moment?
Yes, we have learnt to game the system, and I think we got 11% of the popular vote and 11% of the seats. So you could say for the first time in our history we got a fair outcome. But actually the party is still very committed to reforming the vote system, because the British vote system, it doesn't work. It's producing parliaments that are totally unrepresentative of public opinion, like the present one. I mean, the vast Labour majority is not reflected in the country. It wasn't even at the election time. And it's produced a government which is in office but not in power. It's created a very anomalous situation. And other strands in public opinion are not properly represented in Parliament. The Greens have, I think, only had 2 or 3 MPs. The Reform Party are underrepresented. They ought to be there. And so if we're going to have a Parliament that does represent the people and public opinion, then it needs to change. And we also need to encourage the idea of parties working together, which is what a reform voting system would aim for.
Yeah, and you talk about the Greens. They have a new leader since September, and they've had quite a significant rise in the polls. Do you think that they're a threat to the Liberal Democrats?
No, I think they're aiming at a different political market, if you like. I mean, they're filling the space that used to be occupied by Jeremy Corbyn and his people. And Jeremy and his friends have made such a mess of launching their own party that the Greens have moved into that space. The kind of seats that the Lib Dems target will not have strong representation from the Greens. My own area, Twickenham, was a very good example. And actually, we had a local pact with the Greens. The Lib Dems stood aside in order to have a few Greens elected to the council. I don't think that's going to continue next time, because Polanski is pursuing a very different kind of greenery from the Greens we're used to dealing with. It's now a kind of hard left Corbynite agenda, which is not the ones we're with.
Yeah, and Polanski and the new Green leadership is very outspoken as being the opposition to reform. And in that respect, do you think that Polanski, who's energised the Greens, can be sort of likened in a way to Nigel Farage as being sort of both parties being more of a one-man band rather than a team of people?
Well, they are serious. They are very similar, but they're not quite in that respect. It's what sometimes people call populism, which is offering easy solution to complicated problems. I mean, a good issue is wealth taxation. I mean, I'm actually in favour of taxing asset wealth, but the whole idea that by imposing a 2% tax on billionaires is going to raise vast sums of money is a complete illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion. It's a dangerous kind of populism. It's danger in a different way from what Reform are offering, but it's still completely off the wall. It's not serious politics.
Yeah, and Reform obviously very strong on rhetoric around immigration, and it's principally why people are choosing to vote for them when they choose to vote for Reform. Do you think Reform, though, are starting to become more of a party that's not just about immigration, but also a party that can be trusted on the economy, perhaps?
Oh, I can't see any evidence of that at all. I mean, I'm not sure whether they have an economic policy. I know Farage tried a few weeks ago to set out a programme that didn't involve vast tax cuts, but the idea that they were going to finance the economy in the way they described, I think it was just abandoning the aid programme. It was cheap and nasty. There was the whole idea that you do have to make tough choices in government still seem to evade them. And their support on the ground is almost entirely based on anti-immigration stuff.
Yeah, and Labour have recently announced their latest immigration crackdown, and many of those on the left of the party, and as well as in the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, have spoken out as these policies trying to out-reform reform. Do you think Labour are wrong to try and chase reform like this, or they're actually just doing the right thing?
Well, if that's what they're doing, if they are just trying to chase reform, then that's not good politics, and they're not going to get the credit for it anyway, because people will want the real thing. No, I think the public need to be reassured that immigration is being managed. But actually, immigration on balance is good for the economy. If we, have a reasonably open policy towards people with skills, if we also have a managed process of recognizing genuine refugees, a rapid system of approving or disapproving of applications to remain. I mean, those are things that need doing, but I think this recent package went way over the top.
Yeah. So from that point of view, do you think Keir Starmer, or this perhaps just exemplifies Keir Starmer's sort of lack of principles and lack of a political philosophy in a way?
Yes, well, he seemed to have a political philosophy that was sympathetic to a liberal approach to immigration, but is panicked. I mean, this has happened before. I mean, I lived in Scotland in the late 1960s. My wife was a Kenyanation, as it happened, and you may remember that when the Kenyatta government started pushing out Kenyanations of British nationality, the Labour government then panicked and tried to keep them out. In fact, in the event, the Tories subsequently honoured Britain's citizenship obligations and admitted them, and they've made a major contribution to British life. But the idea of Labour governments panicking over immigration is not new. I mean, what is new now are the small boats, which the government should be pointing out are a genuine problem, but they're a very small part of net immigration into the UK, and people wildly exaggerate the problems associated with it. And we do need a much speedier system of dealing with asylum applications. We do need better cooperation with the French over policing the channel, which is more difficult now that we've left the European Union. It's not an easy problem, but the way that Mrs. Mahmood has reacted to it seemed to be excessive.
Yeah, and whilst Keir Starmer has struggled on the domestic front, he gets a lot of praise for his work on the international stage, particularly in appeasing Donald Trump. in as best he could. But another area that's particularly topical to this week is Donald Trump's peace plan for Ukraine, which has been adjusted slightly. Do you think that there's actually a chance that we're at the end of this war?
Well, we just don't know. We're right in the middle of the process. I think there is a very real risk that too much modification to the plan which Putin and Trump drew up is simply going to result in Putin rejecting it out of hand, and we go back to war. I think there's quite a high probability that that's the outcome. But Britain was right to stand behind Ukraine and to work with other European countries to continue to support them. I don't agree that Starmer was right to adopt such an obsequious approach to Trump. It may have paid a few short-term dividends. Trump was temporarily flattered by going around in a golden coach with the king, but actually I think Britain does need to be a bit more assertive and a little bit more self-confident and a little bit more inclined to work with our European neighbours and, if necessary, stand up to Trump.
Yeah, and working with our European neighbours, do you think defence spending is a big area that we can collaborate?
Well, we're going to have to, and we are going to have to spend more on defence, which is another reason for worry about the budget. The government really does need to come clean and tell the public that if they want properly defended country, as well as decent health and education and all the rest, somebody's going to pay for it.
Yeah, and do you think the West are getting something wrong about Russia and China?
Well, I've been writing about China, as you may know, and visiting China and writing about it. And they are formidable kind of economic competition. But there's also potential substantial benefits of dealing with China, economically speaking. They're not a military threat to the UK. But, you know, there are threats and there are opportunities, as there are any other business relationship. And we've got to get the balance right. Russia is quite different in the sense that they have been openly attacking a European country. They've made it very clear that they are pursuing warfare through so-called grey zones, using cyber attacks, cutting undersea cables, provoking military confrontations. It's a very different setup than the relationship with China, which we've got to treat separately.
Yeah, and we saw recently what some people call the Chinese spy scandal. Do you think China is becoming a real threat to the UK?
Well, there are threats and there are opportunities. It's a question of the two. I thought that the Chinese so-called spy scandal was absolute nonsense. I mean, what they were accused of doing was enlisting the help of a couple of Conservative Party researchers whose espionage consisted of telling the Chinese what they could have read in the Daily Telegraph anyway. And there was somebody who was alleged to have been a member or supporter of the Chinese Communist Party who was working in the office of a very obscure Labour MP. I mean, this is petty stuff. And you contrast that with leading American politicians, including their vice president, let alone Musk, publicly calling for the overthrow of the British government or changing our policies. I mean, that is serious political interference. What the Chinese are doing is annoying and possibly improper, but it's on a different scale.
Yeah. I want to end with just a few quick fire questions. Do you think Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister this time next year?
No, I don't think so. I think they will try and get someone else.
After the May elections?
Yes, probably. Yeah.
Do you think, therefore, that this was Rachel Reeves' last budget as well?
Probably. Not necessarily, but probably.
Do you think we could see an early election?
No, I don't think that's likely. It's not necessary. We desperately need to stop this national ADHD, constantly changing looking for scapegoats, switching leaders, more elections is the last thing we want.
Do you think Donald Trump will win the Nobel Peace Prize?
No, I don't think so.
Do you think that the wave of right-wing populism will continue with J.D. Vance and Nigel Farage?
Well, it will continue with J.D. Vance, probably. Not certainly, but probably. I suspect Nigel Farage may have reached his peak.
And finally, who do you think is the most underrated UK politician?
Well, that's a very, very difficult question. Actually, I think, although it pains me to say it, the leader of the Conservative Party, who is just generally regarded with contempt by almost everybody. I disagree with most of what she says, but she's a perfectly capable, intelligent woman, and is being seriously underestimated, I think.
Yeah, and she did a quite incredible reply to the budget today. She eviscerated. It was something to watch.
Well, I saw a bit of it, and it's obviously been written well in advance. But yes, no, I'd need to see that. But no, I'd say more generally, I think she's not great, and she's very limited in some ways. But your question was underestimated, and I think it certainly is.
So Vince, thanks so much for joining me today.